as that was cratering with, Atari canceling the project and everything, I moved back to the house. And I thought, instead of paying rent on brick and mortar, my rent was going to be a T1 line, which was the fastest line you could get. This is AOL dial-up days. So it was a $2,500 a month, internet connection. This is my rent on the information superhighway. So I had 2 rooms in my house. I had 10 computers. I had an internet server. I had my T1 line, and I was running a business out of my house. It wasn't like just a computer in the corner of my bedroom. It was 2 rooms in my house with a LAN network and a server, and it was dedicated and everything. So when people say, well, how did work change for you in COVID? I'm like, it just caught up. I did this 25 plus years ago,
right.
Working from home. I understood the advantages of doing that, not having to commute somewhere. I was always worried, I had multi-million-dollar deals on the table with companies like Disney, and I'm like, what if they find out I'm just a dude in my house?
Welcome to another episode of Forging the Future with your guest host, Craig Ceccanti. I'm here with Chris Howard. Welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here, Craig.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. Well, let me set up why we're here. And we're in opposite chairs. We're flipping the script a little bit. I was on the show, I don't know, maybe the first 10-ish?
Yeah, I think so.
What do you think? Well, I got a lot of compliments, and a lot of people were coming up to me, specifically JR. John Real came up to me. He's like, man, I learned so much about you. Of course, I watched his episode and many others. Brad Burke, Carrie Colbert was on here. I mean, just so many good ones. Just amazing episodes. And I learned so much about people that I've known in the ecosystem, but I don't feel like people know you as well as I know these people after watching the episode. So I really wanted to get you in the hot seat and get people to know Chris and the amazing journey you've had through entrepreneurship and now as a venture capitalist. So here we go. We're going to start at the beginning.
Okay.
So where did we grow up?
Well, I was actually born in Minnesota and spent the first 5 years in Minneapolis. Then we moved around quite a bit through Texas and Utah and California. I actually lived in Marin County before it was expensive. My dad still talks about selling his house for $60K, and it's probably worth, $1 million now, right? So it was back before it was expensive, and then moved back to Minnesota for 5-6 years, and then...
What drove all the moves?
He actually was working for a company. It was called REI, which is not the one you're thinking of.
Okay.
It's Recognition Equipment Incorporated. It was a company that had figured out how to do fast processing of bank statements and credit cards, and then in the end it was money. So his last position was for the Federal Reserve, where he was maintaining machines that would count money and determine if it was fit or unfit, and if it was unfit, it would shred it. Counterfeit and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting.
No kidding.
I got to go in the vault at one point. The pallets full of $100 bills everywhere. But in California, one of my teachers was very impactful to me, and his name was actually Mr. Brilliant, which is a great name for a teacher.
Come on, that's not his real name.
Yeah, it was his real name.
His nickname or his real name?
No, his actual real name.
His last name was Brilliant?
I think he was my 3rd grade teacher, and he actually got me into building these geometric shapes out of tagboard and using a compass. And so we'd build something for example, it was called a great dodecahedron. And it was like a 5-pointed star out of tagboard. Every point you looked at was a 5-pointed star, or different shapes that you could rotate and be like a star cut out in the inside.
Uh-huh.
And it was a geometry book, and actually I remember him giving it to me, and it was really pretty advanced, for a 3rd grader, and I was building these big models and everything with him, and so it was very, very inspiring, and even back then I thought about being like an architect, and so you think about teachers and the impact on students. There are certain teachers that really have can have an outsized impact on your life.
But let's talk about computers. It's something we have in common.
Okay.
Computer science major. What was your first computer, and what really got you excited about computers?
Yeah, I would say my first exposure, it was really, really indirect in a way. There was a summer class. For some reason, I signed up to a summer class to build a kayak, right? Every person was going to be able to build their own kayak. I don't know why.
Out of wood?
It was acrylic or something. And so, and my brother took a programming class. right? And so the first day of class, we get to the kayak place and they're like, look, we got bad news. Someone came in and dumped over all the resin. We have like one drum of resin left. We're going to build one kayak for the class. And I'm like, yeah, I'm out. I don't want to build a community kayak. And so I started hanging out. I wanted to get into the class my brother was in. They're doing a programming class. And that for some reason, the class was full, right? And so I was hanging out outside the room, and at some point he said, no, you can't do this anymore, right? And so I would wait until my brother came home and we'd go over like what he learned in class, and we created this game together, and it was called Sky Fox or something. And it was basically, back then there was no screens, and it was a printer, and usually it was a teletype terminal with a coupler to the mainframe downtown, right? And so we decided to build this, like it would print out this crosshair, right? And the plane would be like this little X. And when the plane you'd move, it would draw out 3 planes, and you're trying to move your crosshair to get over that plane and then shoot it down, right? And then when it was in the center, because the center was a plus sign, when it was in the center, the X and the plus became an asterisk, right? And then if you got it lined up, you could then shoot.
Okay.
And so what we would do is we would make the carriage move all the way across the teletype. So it would be like chugga, 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 chugga. And then if it actually shot the plane down with ding, ding, and you'd shoot it down and stuff. So it was, that was my first, it was basic, right? It was basic programming language. And so I was writing a program with him. And then at some point, I think I ended up finishing that game and kind of took over the project.
All right, let's fast forward a little bit. How did you get to Houston?
So I graduated high school in Florida, and my aunt lived in Houston, and she really wanted me to come to Houston. And so she suggested that I apply to Rice. And I'm like, what's Rice? I actually did pretty well on the SATs and the ACTs, and I was getting all these colleges reaching out to me, but I thought that was just all spam. Everybody gets that, right? And so I applied to Rice, got my recommendations, did my interviews, but I got denied. I did not get accepted, which I hopefully chalk up to the fact that I applied about 2 months before the beginning of the semester. But I think my aunt actually applied to U of H for me.
Okay.
That's how badly she wanted me to come to Houston and get to college, I guess. And so, and they actually accepted me into their honors program. So it was honors and I decided on electrical engineering. I was trying to decide between architecture, computer science, and electrical engineering, and I made a bad decision. And I picked because of electrical engineers make more money, right? And so, and I also thought electrical engineering was going to be more about circuit board design and stuff like that. But 40 years ago, that's not what it was about. So I started going to college at U of H, and I took my only formal programming class, which was a Fortran programming class. And again, it was on paper punch cards, so Hollerith cards, and got some exposure to programming there. But one of the big things that I got out of U of H was the co-op program. So I did a co-op program back then was a work program. I got married very young, right? So about 2 years into college, I got married. I needed to start working, started to raise a family, and needed to work. So co-op would allow you're supposed to go and work for a company like HLMP, which was like the Centerpoint, is now the light company, for a semester, and then you go to go to school for a semester. And so I got an opportunity to work at the light company, and it was in their computer-aided drafting department. So I'm like, this is great because it's drafting and computers, right? And so I did that for about 8 months. And then when it was time to go back to that, they were going to put me through a rotation. It was like, and they wanted you to get more exposure to the rest of the company, but I was not interested in power line transmission and all that other stuff. So I heard about an opportunity at IBM down at NASA. They had co-ops down there. So I really pestered the person down there to get an opportunity to co-op for IBM. It was the IBM Federal System Division supporting NASA. So it was across the street from NASA, space shuttle program. And that was really my first exposure to computers because there was the department's only computer was in the hallway. And I remember an IBM engineer coming up to me at one point and saying, why don't you become an expert on this thing? I thought, well, that's a fantastic idea. And so within 2 weeks, I talked my department's manager and said, I'm tired of sitting in the hallway. Why don't I take the department's only PC and put it on my desk, right? And so it was a IBM PC, dual floppies, no hard drive, monochrome green display, very basic, but started to learn everything I could about it. And then as the other IBM engineers started to get computers, they'd come to ask me questions because I was the expert. So I was the guy that had actually read the manual, right? And so that made me the expert. And it was just a fantastic learning experience because IBM had something called, they had an internal network. It was pre-internet, right? But they had a network where you could actually go and put your programs, and they would, you could share it, what they call IUO, internal use only. So you could put whatever program you wrote out on the internal IBM network and people would download it and use it,
Nice.
But I was working on prototyping, like what does the user interface look like for a space station? An astronaut using gloves and keyboard interface, trackball interface, touch panel interface, voice input and output, and prototyping the space station workstation. And I was able to work on there for about 2.5 years.
What do you think the similarity is for engineers today? Like you really grabbed the bulls by the horn. You said, I'm going to put this computer on my desk and learn it. And that really sounded like it set your career off into a great trajectory. What is that for a young engineer today? Mm-hmm. What would they need to do going into a new company to set themselves up for success like that?
If I was going to do something similar, it would be just basically being open to ideas of putting yourself out there and volunteering. And I say at IBM, maybe was just, they treated me like any other engineer. So I had an office with a guy that had been there for 40 years, right? I was being assigned things like anybody else would be assigned if it was a college graduate, and willing to learn and work. So while at IBM, I taught myself BASIC, I taught myself Turbo Pascal, I taught myself assembly language, I taught myself Ada because that's what they were using at the time, right? So it was really like doing more than I was asked to do, right? Yep. And so, and I think that was the reason why, again, I mean, most co-ops, they had a class of co-ops. I was the only co-op that had a desk. Everybody else was in the lab. I was the only co-op they allowed to stay past the 4 months, right? Right. Hey, I'd like to stay here. Maybe part of that is that they knew I did have a wife and family, so that was of course what was driving me there. But maybe also they saw that I had this, the right attitude of, hey, I'm going to learn this and I can actually help and deliver and be a contributor. And so that they let me work for 2.5 years there and go to school at night instead of going alternating semesters.
Good career advice. Make yourself useful, learn new things. They'll keep you around.
Yeah, I mean, really, that's true. That's probably true for most things in life, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I just got celebrated the 10-year anniversary. So
there you go.
It's everywhere. Okay, now we're in our computers. We started a career, but let's talk about Softeq. Where did that come from? How did you go from there to starting your first business?
Yeah. So while at IBM, the other cool thing about it, because they treated me like I was an IBM employee, they had a program where you could buy a computer for 50% off.
Okay.
Right. Okay. And back then, a computer cost about $10,000. Right. So 50% was $5,000. Then the other thing that they did was like, oh, you're an IBM employee, so here's an IBM credit card with a $5,000 balance line. Right. Oh, so nice. I was able to go in, buy an IBM AT at that point with like a color graphics monitor and a printer, and have one at home. Right. And then I thought, well,
how big of a deal was that? And what year are we talking about? Was like how many people had computers at home at that point?
I don't know. Probably not all that many. I mean, because it was a fairly large purchase. This was around 1985, 86, something like that. Back then Byte magazine was already getting pretty big, and Microsoft was a thing. They had Microsoft Windows 1.0, and I remember having a sense of not like, man, I wish I'd gotten on the ground floor of this whole PC thing, And but obviously I was, right. Yeah. But I thought, I'm a co-op. I'm making $12 an hour, which was better than $3 an hour, which was minimum wage. Mm-hmm. But it was like I thought, well, I could be a consultant. Right. So some of the other IBM engineers were doing side jobs and stuff. So I thought, well, I'll just get some business cards printed up. Chris Howard, computer consultant. And somehow, I don't know how I got my first job. I ran across a guy it was a doctor, who was a cardiologist, and wanted to do essentially digital transformation of the process of how they did heart electrophysiology, right? So they would do it on thermal optical paper and then take calipers and try to measure and try to figure out what's wrong with your heart rhythm. So essentially threading a catheter up through your leg, surrounding the heart with 16 sensors, and then collecting that analog data, converting to digital, displaying it on a high-res display, and writing it in real time to a write once, read mostly optical drive. And this is 1987. Right. So that would be like an interesting project today.
Sure.
And I also had to put the hardware together for that. Right. And I thought, I tried to convince the guy to let me do like a proof of concept and still keep my job.
Oh, he just had an idea.
It was an idea. He was a cardiologist.
Wow.
And so he worked at MD Anderson, or he was in the cardiology program. And, he wanted me to go all in on this. And I thought, you know what? I'll quit my job at IBM. But you have to pay me 30 days in advance and give me 30 days notice, right? And the advantage to me was I was living in Sharpstown, commuting all the way down to Clear Lake, and then going to night school downtown at University of Houston, and then back again, spending a lot of time doing that. It's like, well, I could be at home, work from home, be near my kids, and go to college, right? And so and get paid more money, right? And so I started it. I'm sure my family thought I was crazy quitting IBM. Nobody quit IBM back then. That was the gold standard, right? Yeah. And so, but I felt that I had a safety net. IBM said, okay, great. Sorry to see you go, but come back when you get your degree or when you finish doing whatever you're doing here. Yeah. So I felt that I had an opportunity to come back to that, that I wasn't leaving it behind. And, so that was like my first big consulting project. And 30 days in, he gives me my notice.
Oh, no.
So I felt pretty stupid about that.
Welcome to entrepreneurship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I think the problem is that after 30 days, he hadn't seen any progress because I'm putting the hardware together. I've got third-party optical drives, third-party ADD card, third-party graphics card that I had to program the whole UI myself. It's not like it's already running Windows, right? And so there's a lot of like underneath the hood stuff to do. And so what I did was, I could go start looking for a job right away, but I decided instead, for some reason, to take 2 weeks and create a demo. I recognized the guy needed to see something. Right. And so I worked for a couple of weeks on the demo, invited him back. I said, imagine for a second we're done. We're not done, but imagine for a second, this is how it would look, and this is how it would work. And I had like a sine wave generator, and I was displaying some graphics, and I had it. It was all essentially like working, and that got him excited enough to to continue the project. Okay. But at the time, also, he's like, "Well, I want you to write it in Fortran." I'm like, "Well, I know Fortran, but I mean, this is high res graphics and data. It needs to be in C, right?" He's like, "Well, do you know C?" And I said, no. Yes. But that doesn't change my opinion, because by then I'd already known a assembly language. I knew Pascal. I knew a lot of language. It didn't really matter to me that it was C. I'm like, okay, it's just, is it a curly brace for if then else, or what is it? And so, but he wanted it in Fortran because he knew how to read Fortran.
Oh, really? Okay.
But, then went in to finish. I mean, that was like maybe a year and a half, worked on that project, delivered it. He went on to build the company, and I think he sold it, and so, but I started doing other consulting and stuff. So I was like Chris Howard consultant.
Tell me you have one of those business cards.
I do, actually. I probably could find that.
That'd be fun.
And and in the meantime, in parallel, I was like, well, I want to learn how to do this entrepreneurship thing, right? So I recognized, because of the graphics cards back then, you're staring at a DOS prompt. How do you display an image? Like they had the super VGA cards all had different interfaces, different ways to program. And if you were a programmer, you couldn't just display an image, right? And so I created a software SDK and started advertising in the back of like Byte Magazine and PC Magazine to sell a toolkit, because I'm like, well, I only have to sell 10 toolkits and I'm making more money than I'm making now, right? Per month, right? But I need to start a business. I need to figure out, how to accept credit cards. How do I advertise? How do I get a manual printed? How do I get disc duplicated? And just try to figure out the whole entrepreneurship thing. And I thought, well, I don't have a better idea than this, and I'm going to try to practice on this idea. So when I do get that big, great idea, I'll know how to run a business, right? But then that turned into a 10-year business. That was called Genesis Microprogramming, and it was I built it into the largest graphics toolkit company at the time, which meant about $1.5 million in revenue. So it wasn't really like nowadays, But I thought, well, that taught me that maybe you need to look at what market size is before you go into a business. And then also you get stuck on an idea. Like all of a sudden you've got a business, you got people working for you, you got people supporting their families. You can't just like pivot into something else because you got a next bright idea, right? Yeah. But I essentially ended up doing that after about 10 years because Microsoft finally got Windows right with Windows 95 and they didn't need graphics toolkits anymore, right?
That's right.
So
is that your full focus? That, or were you also doing other consulting?
I had some consulting projects at this because I started advertising the toolkit, right? Yeah. And so I'm spending money, $800 for an ad in the back of PC Magazine. I got an 800 number. The phone starts ringing. One of my brothers was, I hired him to start answering the phones while I was off doing consulting and stuff like that. And the phone starts ringing, and it's other magazines. Right? Oh. They're like, oh, we see you ran an ad in PC Magazine. How about you write an ad in Byte Magazine? And now you're paying for an 800 number and you're getting calls from other people that spend money. But the big break on the graphics toolkit company was getting reviewed. And I actually tried to work on getting like PC Week and somebody to review the toolkit. Yep. And we finally scored a review in PC Week. And the weird thing is we got a review in PC Week, and then literally 1 or 2 weeks after that, another review like in PC Week. I don't know how that actually happened because we were, I guess, pursuing several different writers. Yeah. And that all of a sudden, because we were selling onesie, twosie toolkits for a while, and then all of a sudden we're off to selling 10 a week, 20 a week, 40 a week. And that validity of getting the product reviewed just made a huge difference.
Right. Let's hit that fast forward button again. So talk me to the birth of Softeq, the official, like when was the name picked? When did that happen? And then give me a rundown of that. Cause I think that's a part of Softeq people don't really know as well as the venture fund part, which we'll get to. But talk about the services piece.
Sure. Well, what happened with Genesis was I tried to pivot into video games. Because that had the big target market. It was the days of Atari coming out. It was Nintendo and Sega. Atari was coming back out. 3DO was coming back out. I saw it as an opportunity to get into the game market and thinking about games being one of the hardest programs you can write because you've got graphics, you've got performance, you've got creativity. We had all that low-level experience. And so I thought, well, I'm going to pivot Genesis into video game development. And so I felt like it was, again, a chicken and egg problem. I couldn't go to Nintendo and Sega to get a dev kit because I'm like, hey, I want your dev kit. I want to write a Nintendo game. And they're like, well, how many games have you actually written? I haven't written any. That's why I'm asking for a dev kit. And they're like, go write some games and come back and we'll talk, right? So what I decided to do was try to get a hook. So I actually licensed the Nerf name from Hasbro. Talk to them because what I wanted to do, I had 5 kids and we would play something we called Nerf War in our game room with bazookas and Nerf bow and arrows and we're running around shooting each other. And I'm like, I want to create a version of Doom, which was based in hell, right? I don't want my kids playing that game. I want to play a game like Nerf, bright colors, toys and stuff like that in the game room. And I thought if I could license the Nerf name, I could get a publisher interested. Right. So I'm going to create something. I call it Nerf War tentatively. And actually I got to meet, John Carmack and John Romero from id Software. They're from Dallas, right? I got to go up there, bring in a box of Nerf toys and Nerf weapons. And John Carmack, who was recently the chief scientist at Facebook and Meta on Oculus, right? That's what he's doing now. But back then he was the architect of Doom. And I actually got Atari interested to be a publisher, and Hasbro is interested because I had Atari. So I literally signed both agreements practically on the same day for the license, trying not to get stepped on by these 2 elephants. But then Atari went bankrupt in the middle of that deal. And by then Hasbro had started Hasbro Interactive, and they're like, we don't care if you spend $100,000 on the Nerf license. And we don't care whether your producer went over to Sony and is ready to still do the game. We're done, right? And so I thought, well, okay, I've got to pivot into something else. So essentially, Softeq is a pivot from Genesis, Going back to my consulting roots of my interest in doing projects like that, electrophysiology project, where like an innovative, hard to do, software project or hardware project. And I actually started working for Compaq here in Houston and under Genesis. And then I created Softeq because I wanted that division of Genesis was this toolkit company. Softeq is now technical software development, doing innovative projects like that, medical application. And Compaq was creating the first PC TV hybrid. So it was a 36-inch screen, which meant a 200-pound monitor, Compaq Presario desktop, and the first DVD player in a computer, and just around my interest of what I thought was an interesting consulting project.
Cool. So how did it grow from where it was at the very beginning, Softeq the name, to where it is today?
Yeah.
What were the major milestones?
Yeah, so if you think about Genesis, we had an office, and I moved actually so as that was cratering with Atari canceling the project and everything, I moved back to the house because no one ever came by my office, and I thought instead of paying rent on brick and mortar, my rent was going to be a T1 line, which was the fastest line you could get. This is AOL dial-up days, right?
It's a big deal.
So it was a $2,500 a month internet connection that if it went down at 2:00 in the morning, AT&T had to come out and fix it at 2:00 in the morning, right? This is my rent on the information superhighway. So I had 2 rooms in my house. I had 10 computers. I had an internet server. I had my T1 line, and I was running a business out of my house. And now back then there was a stigma attached with that, right? Because if you didn't have a real office, you weren't a real business. But I was working with Compaq. The funny thing is, as soon as I did that, within a month, they're like, "Oh, I'm going to come out and do a site audit." Like, you got to be kidding me. No. I had an office for 10 years, you're going to come out now. But they came out and they liked it because it wasn't just a computer in the corner of my bedroom. It was 2 rooms in my house with a LAN network and a server, and it was dedicated and everything. This is great. I want to work here. Right?
Nice.
So when people say, well, how did work change for you in COVID? I'm like, it just caught up. I did this 25 plus years ago, working from home, homeschool our kids. I understood the advantages of doing that, not having to commute somewhere, but just had to be fast on the mute button because if the dog was barking or the kids were playing, are you at home? Are you a real business? And so now it's like, was that your dog, your cat, your kid? That's so cute. I wish I was doing that.
Oh, they're like, bring him in.
Yeah,
bring
exactly.
Him in. Yeah.
Oh, that's but back then, no. So I was always worried. I had multi-million-dollar deals on the table with companies like Disney, and I'm like, what if they find out I'm just a dude in my house, right? Never lied about it, but I also didn't promote it. So how did it grow? Well, it was really just. It turns out if you do what you said, when you said, for how much you said, companies come back to you. So Compaq is like, well, this. I think 2 important points here. I wasn't Chris Howard consultant for Compaq. I understood that I needed to create a business and that businesses knew and like an API of working with another business. I have a website. I've got a company name. I've got email addresses like sales@softeq.com. They all go to me, but it's like the API as the company grows. Guess what? 27 years later, there's still sales@softeq.com, but there's 400 people behind that, right? And so then what happened was it allowed for the organic growth where Compaq is like, out of all of our vendors on this PCTV project, Softeq's the one that's actually delivering, right? Let's give them more work. Okay. And so as they gave me more work, then I would just bring in other people or work 80 hours a week, right? And so but because of that business-to-business API, it wasn't like, if I was just Chris Howard, they wouldn't have given me more work. Right. They're like, Chris has enough to do. He's not going to do anything, more than that. So, and then at some point, Disney approached Compaq and they, hey, we want you to create this. We want Compaq to create this assistive technology headset. And it was hardware and software and stuff. And it was 5,000 units and it was a couple $1 million project, but it was too small for Compaq. They're like, hey, why don't you ask Softeq to do it? And I had never done a hardware project before, but I'm not, my background's electrical engineering. I've been around all these hardware companies before. And I like project managing a hardware project isn't that much different than a software project, right? And so I actually went and, created a proposal, and I had Compaq and HP recommending me for the job to Disney. So it was one of those deals where Disney contracted to Compaq or HP, and HP contracted to Softeq, but Softeq did all the work on the project. And we actually created 5,000 headsets, custom developed headsets, mechanical engineering, battery engineering, safety, and all of that, and a 20-unit custom lithium-ion battery charger. And the firmware and software, and delivered it start to finish in 6 months. And they're like, wow, that's the most successful project we've ever done at Disney, right? But that was my first hardware project.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just meant like finding a guy in, like, I find my mechanical engineer in Seattle, my contract manufacturer in Korea, my battery guy is in, Portland, and just really just bringing in partners and project managing a solution. But it was pretty cool to be going to Disney and wandering around behind the scenes in your, work clothes. It was kind of like out of body experience in a way. Like, shouldn't I have my mouse ears on or whatever? But it's basically delivering, which is why our motto now is Softeq. We deliver, right? It turns out you do that, then word of mouth and organic recommendations, and people know they can bring you into a project and not get fired, right?
So that's something some people don't know. So what is Softeq services, and how would they engage you? Like, what's a project that someone would bring to you and would be a good fit to work with?
I guess because of our and my background of hardware and electrical engineering, I've always felt like a better understanding of the hardware makes you a better, firmware and software engineer, right? So working with Compaq and working with all their printer drivers and working with different, music players and working with other kinds of hardware over the years taught me a lot about, hardware projects. And so we've done a lot of work with consumer electronics. And so embedded at Softeq is a core focus for us. Mm-hmm. But we do hardware, firmware, mobile, web backend, AI, ML, and data analytics all under one roof, right? So if it's an IoT project or a wearable project or a medical project, then that checks all the boxes. But I mean, if someone just has a mobile app or they just need some firmware done or they need some help with their hardware, we can do those projects, and then we often get pulled into other parts and pieces of that. And how do they engage? Well, they just reach out through the website or give us a ring, and we put in a solution architect on it and go through an RFX process and figure out what they need and whether we're a good fit or not, and go from there.
Awesome. Okay, we're gonna switch gears again now. So we're gonna move to Softeq's 27 years, celebrating
in February.
27 in February. Mm-hmm. So coming up, that's quite a run. So you've mastered the domain of software services, if it ever can be said. Mm-hmm. And at some point, you transitioned and started doing some angel investing. Mm-hmm. So how did you get involved in that? Thinking about bringing your checkbook out, and getting involved with other entrepreneurs.